If you look into a teenager's bedroom today, you will see a space dominated by glowing screens, wireless earbuds, and an infinite stream of digital content. It is a world where every piece of music ever recorded is available at the touch of a button, entirely hidden from the rest of the household. For the modern generation, a private connection to the outside world is taken for granted. But if you grew up in the 1940s or early 1950s, privacy was a luxury that simply did not exist. Back then, music was a collective family experience, heavily policed by the gatekeepers of the household. The center of entertainment was the living room console radio, a massive, heavy piece of furniture built from polished walnut or mahogany. It was powered by glowing glass vacuum tubes that took several minutes to warm up, and it was plugged firmly into the living room wall. Because of its size and its permanence, the family radio belonged entirely to the parents. Whatever music, news, or serial programs played from that speaker had to be approved by the head of the house. If a teenager wanted to listen to the exciting, thumping rhythms of early rhythm and blues or rock and roll, they had to do it in the open, usually enduring the disapproving glares, sighs, or outright bans of their elders. Entertainment was communal, centralized, and thoroughly supervised. But as the mid-1950s arrived, a quiet technological revolution took place that would forever shatter this domestic dynamic. It didn't arrive with the loud explosion, but rather in a small, pocket-sized plastic box. It was called the transistor radio. For the very first time in human history, music became portable, affordable, and most importantly, completely personal. The transistor radio did not just change how a generation listened to music. It gave teenagers their very first taste of true personal freedom. It became an ideological wedge driven straight between the traditional family structure and the exploding, rebellious youth culture. Tonight, we are going to slip back into the era when a tiny earplug was a badge of independence. We are going to turn the dial, brave the static, and rediscover how the transistor radio created the modern teenager right under the covers of a midnight bed. To truly understand how miraculous the transistor radio felt to a teenager in the late 1950s and 1960 seconds, you have to look at the sheer engineering brilliance of the device itself. Before this era, radios were heavy, fragile, and hot to the touch because of the vacuum tubes inside them. If you dropped a radio, it was broken. If you wanted to take it to the park, you simply couldn't. That all changed with the invention of the transistor at Bell Labs, a tiny solid-state component that could amplify electrical signals using a fraction of the power and a fraction of the space. When companies like Regency and Sony used this technology to create pocket-sized consumer radios, they didn't just build a new appliance, they accidentally created a cultural icon. These little boxes were made from lightweight, brightly colored plastics like polystyrene or bakelite. They were sleek, futuristic, and small enough to be slipped into a coat pocket, a school bag, or the glove compartment of a car. For the first time, a radio didn't require an electrical outlet. It ran on a simple, square 9-volt battery. You could carry a world of music right in the palm of your hand. For a teenager, buying a transistor radio was an incredible milestone. It was often the very first piece of technology they ever owned completely by themselves, saved up for using pocket money, paper route earnings, or babysitting cash. That little plastic box belonged to them, not to the family. It was a personal statement. But the physical portability of the radio was only half of the equation. The real magic happened when you coupled that portability with a tiny, overlooked accessory that came bundled in the box, a single, flesh-colored earphone wrapped in a thin, fragile wire. That earphone changed everything. It transformed listening from an out-of-the-way, policed activity into an entirely invisible, intensely private experience. You could sit at the dinner table with your family, your hands perfectly folded, your parents discussing the local news, while a secret wire ran up your sleeve, into your collar, and directly into your ear, pumping out the latest rhythm and blues or rebellious rock anthems. The living room walls had effectively been breached. Teenagers had found a loophole in the domestic rules, and they were about to use it to create an entirely new nighttime ritual that defined a generation. When the sun went down and the house grew quiet, the transistor radio assumed its most important role, as a gateway to a secret nighttime sanctuary. During the day, you had to be careful. You had to worry about school, chores, and the watchful eyes of adults. But once you were sent to bed and the bedroom door was firmly closed, the night belonged entirely to you. Millions of teenagers across the country developed an identical, unspoken ritual. They would wait until they heard the heavy footsteps of their parents walking down the hall, followed by the definitive click of the master bedroom light switch. Once the house fell into absolute stillness, the operation began. You would reach under your pillow or slip your hand into a bedside drawer, pulling out the cold, plastic rectangle of your transistor radio. With absolute precision, you would slide the single earphone into your ear, or sometimes, you would place the entire radio directly under your pillowcase. The thick fabric of the pillow acted as a natural muffler, absorbing the sound so perfectly that you could hear the music clearly through your jawbone, while anyone standing just 2 feet away in the hallway would hear nothing but absolute silence. With a gentle click of the volume wheel, a burst of static would whisper directly into your ear. You would slowly turn the tuning dial, watching the red needle glide past the numbers, searching for those distant, powerful AM radio signals that only truly came alive after dark. Because of a fascinating atmospheric phenomenon known as AM skywave propagation, nighttime radio waves could bounce off the ionosphere and travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles across the country. Suddenly, a teenager sitting in a quiet, rural farm town in Ohio or a sleepy village in the English countryside wasn't isolated anymore. Through that tiny wire, they were directly plugged into the beating heart of the cultural underground. They could tune into legendary stations like WABC in New York, Dulles in Chicago, or the pirate broadcasts of Radio Caroline blasting from a ship anchored in the North Sea. These stations played a wild, unfiltered soundtrack that simply didn't exist during daytime family programming. It was a thrilling world of fast-talking disc jockeys, driving bass lines, and emotional vocal harmonies that made your heart race. Huddled under the covers, clutching that warm piece of plastic, you weren't just a kid in a bedroom anymore. You were an active participant in a massive, invisible nationwide youth movement, and every single song that spun through the dark felt like a personal message broadcasted just for you. The music flowing through those thin copper wires was revolutionary, but it required a special master of ceremonies to give it a voice. These were the legendary late-night disc jockeys, the DJs. Before the transistor radio announcers were polite, formal, and spoke in measured, transatlantic tones designed to appeal to middle-aged parents. But the late-night AM DJs were an entirely different breed. They were fast-talk, energetic, and completely uninhibited. They didn't just play records. They spoke directly to the teenagers, using a secret language of slang, inside jokes, and frantic rhythm. Names like Wolfman, Jack, Alan, Freed, and Cousin Brucky became mythic figures to millions of young listeners. They were the cool older brothers or the rebellious uncles that teenagers wished they had. When a DJ spun the latest 45 revolutions per minute vinyl record by Chuck Berry, the Beatles, Motown artists, or the Supremes, they didn't just introduce a song, they validated the teenage experience. They talked about the trials of high school, the heartbreak of young love, and the frustration of being misunderstood by adults. To a kid listening under the blankets, that voice was a lifeline. It felt like the only person who truly understood them was talking straight to them from a studio hundreds of miles away. This created a massive generational divide. Parents across the country grew deeply alarmed by the influence of these airwave rebels. They viewed rock and roll as a dangerous, corrupting force that encouraged delinquency and structural defiance. Across millions of households, a strict daytime embargo was placed on rock music. But the beauty of the transistor radio was that it made parental bans completely irrelevant. You could get lectured at the dinner table about your attitude, your hair, or your grades, and you could politely nod your head in compliance. But a few hours later, under the cover of darkness, you were right back in control of your own world. With a single turn of that plastic dial, you bypassed the parental censorship entirely. The transistor radio effectively decentralized the American and British household. It tore the monopoly of culture away from the living room couch and handed it directly to the youth. And once teenagers realized they had the power to choose their own soundtrack, they began to demand the power to choose their own identity. By the time the late 1960s bloomed into the 1970s, the pocket-sized plastic box had accomplished something monumental. It had officially birthed the modern concept of youth culture. Before the transistor radio, children were largely expected to transition directly into miniature versions of their parents dressing like them, listening to their music, and adopting their social values. But by giving teenagers a private, unmonitored space to explore their own tastes, the transistor radio allowed a distinct generational identity to explode into the mainstream. It changed the fashion industry, fueled the vinyl record boom, and gave a voice to the massive social and cultural movements that defined the era. The freedom that began as a quiet whisper under a cotton pillowcase eventually spilled out onto the beaches, the high schools, and the protest rallies of the wider world. As technology marched forward, the humble AM transistor radio eventually gave way to the boombox, the Walkman, the MP3 player, and ultimately, the smartphone. Today, the idea of carrying an infinite universe of media in your pocket is no longer a miracle. It is a basic expectation of daily life. Yet, for all the incredible power of our modern digital devices, something deeply magical has been lost along the way. Today's technology isolates us completely behind noise-canceling glass and algorithms designed just for one person. But the transistor radio, despite its privacy, was a tool of massive shared connection. When you tuned into that faint, crackling AM skywave signal under your blanket, you knew that millions of other kids across the country were staring up at their ceilings, listening to the exact same static, and feeling the exact same heartbeat of excitement at the exact same second. You were independent from your parents, but you were deeply dependent on your peers. The small plastic shells, the chrome grills, and the fragile, single earphone wires have largely vanished into vintage antique shops and memory boxes. But for the generation that lived it, that little radio remains the ultimate symbol of a golden era. It was the device that broke the rules, expanded our horizons, and gave us our very first unforgettable taste of true personal freedom. Thank you for turning back the dial with us today. If you remember the thrill of hiding a transistor radio under your pillow, waiting for the static to clear, or tuning into your favorite late-night DJ, please share your memories in the comments below. We would absolutely love to hear your stories. Until next time, keep the music playing, cherish your memories, and take care.